Blog viewers, we'll continue on our practical wisdom series today, and obviously a huge part of practical wisdom, and which I'm sure to some extent we've covered in either the practical wisdom series or some of the other posts on some of the other subjects, is distinguishing reality and fantasy. And obviously it seems so simple at first, it's like why would this be so difficult? We all know what's fantasy and we all know what's reality, and I think that's to some extent true. For example, it's a Friday night and you're going to the movies. You're going to go see an action-adventure thriller, and there's a lot of crazy special effects in the movie. There's maybe aliens and huge car chases, lots of fighting, lots of shooting, and you step into the movie theater and maybe you don't say it, but this is fantasy. You know that what you're seeing is not really real. It's projected on the screen, so it has the reality of the images on the screen. But it wouldn't ever happen like this outside of a movie theater. Even if you lived another billion years on Earth, you probably wouldn't ever step outside of your front door and see the sorts of stuff that you see in that movie. So because of that, you know that what you're seeing is fantasy. So I think almost all of us can distinguish correctly between reality and fantasy in the case of going to movies. But how good are we in distinguishing between reality and fantasy in everyday life? How good are we in separating thoughts that sort of float into our mind on a moment-to-moment basis into either a reality camp or a fantasy camp? How good are we at doing that? And I'm not so sure most of us are very good at that kind of thing at all. To be good at distinguishing reality and fantasy, you have to, at minimum, I think, articulate coherently what are the key characteristics of reality and what are the key characteristics of fantasy. And have you ever thought about that question? Have you ever made such an articulation of the distinguishing features of reality and fantasy? And I'm going to go ahead, and if you haven't, I would say you're probably not very good at distinguishing reality and fantasy. So in this post, I'll go ahead and try to offer what I think are some key, at least 4 distinguishing characteristics of reality and 4 distinguishing characteristics of fantasy. The first, I'll start with reality first, and I'll label this first point, world serves its own needs. This is a lyric from the REM song, It's the End of the World as We Know It, and I Feel Fine. And what does this lyric mean? A lyric I like very much. I think it's an incredible lyric. Basically, I think it means the world, including nature, the earth, all animals on earth, all plants, the weather on earth, all of this stuff that's included in our very large conception of the world. The world does basically whatever it wants to do without much of a concern for how you, the individual, would want things to shake out. Once in a while you get lucky, and what you do coincides with what is also going to serve what will serve the world's needs. But those are very rare cases. Most of the time you want something very badly, and it's not in the world's plans and needs, and so you don't get it. So that's characteristic 1 of reality. It serves its own needs without bothering to consult with you and make sure it complies with how you wish things to go. This is, I think, a somewhat brutal view of reality, but I would argue its brutality is no argument against its truth. There are brutal truths, and this may be one of those. 2, the second characteristic of reality is that people in general are not nearly as interesting, smart, beautiful, generous, kind, fit, competent at their jobs, whatever positive attributes you want to insert here, as you imagine them to be, or that they wish to project themselves to be to the public. This is becoming a more difficult truth to appreciate now because of a digital age, a corporate age, an advertising age, in which everyone is so carefully projecting digitally, usually, a flattering, scripted image of their lives and their personality and their character to the world. But I would argue once you get beyond most of this fluff, you see people for what they are, and the reality is that they are not nearly, they don't have nearly as much of that positive attribute that they pretend to have in reality, as you would think. The third characteristic of reality is that accomplishing almost anything of value is often brutally demanding and difficult on every level. Again, I'll make this point later again. When I say accomplishing something of value, what I mean by that is I'm not talking about chores. I'm not talking about tasks like depositing a check through mobile checking or depositing a check at the bank. Some technology has made some of these chore-like tasks, these errands, a little bit easier to perform and less difficult. But I would argue that nonetheless, putting aside those low-value types of tasks and errands and chores, accomplishing anything of value is brutally demanding and difficult on every level. And what do I mean by every level? I mean mentally, I mean emotionally, physically, psychologically. We often see only the tail end of an achievement. The pianist after he's spent decades perfecting his craft. The pitcher that's been pitching since age 8, and we see him throwing a no-hitter or a perfect game and making it look so easy. That's illusion. In that second, or when the pianist or the pitcher is marveling you, you're not seeing the decades of brutal, demanding work and toil it took to get there. And so I think, again, third characteristic of reality is accomplishing almost anything of value is very demanding and difficult on almost every level. A fourth characteristic I would say of reality is that the constant emotional condition or tenor of reality is sort of a neutral, boring tediousness. That is the constant emotional tenor of reality. It's not excitement, it's not fear, it's not intrigue, and it's not newness. Most things happen in reality on a daily basis, repetitively. And by the time you're in your mid-30s or mid-40s or mid-50s, you've seen these same things happen many thousands of times. There is absolutely nothing in these things to get excited, angry, or intrigued about. There's nothing new in them. It's just the same old, and you plow through it. So what I argue is reality in a sort of emotional, a common characteristic is neutral, boring tediousness, and not any of the other ways that we could characterize it. Now, fantasy, what are the distinguishing characteristics of fantasy, of a mode of thought that we could label fantasy? One, and some of these I just took because I think they're so important to get both the flip side, both express the reality side and the fantasy side, but I got the fantasy one by just basically canceling out what I just said on the reality part, and or just taking the opposite view. So the first one for fantasy would be that the world does serve your needs. The world does care about what you want. That's pure illusion as well. Almost everyone, I think, clings to this illusion because it's comforting, because it's psychologically might allow us to function and take things and give a good effort in doing things that we want to do and just living in general. But so I think almost everyone clings to this illusion in some form or another. But I think people, there are degrees here, and I think certain extremely selfish, narcissistic people do so in an especially pronounced way of believing delusionally that the world will serve their needs or care what they want. The second distinguishing characteristic of fantasy is, again, this was a flip of what I had already said, is that you can quickly and painlessly accomplish most things you want. That's pure fantasy. Again, because of technology, you can do some chores and errands quickly and effortlessly. Again, the good example is mobile check deposit, but these tend to be very low value tasks. A third characteristic of a sort of a view that stresses fantasy or of a fantastic worldview is that the love of another person is some sort of final solution to the challenge of life. I think some people obviously believe that, and often I think it's not a solution at all, but creates many additional problems that you wouldn't have had to deal with otherwise. And even when love is some form of solution, it's not a final solution, but only serves some challenges posed by life. For example, being alone. So, but a view that stresses that love is sort of some sort of final, ultimate solution to life and the challenges of life is I think, fantasy. Fourth characteristic of a fantasy or a view of fantasy would be that there is some meaning. There's some meaning in everything that happens. Nothing happens senselessly without a reason, without some higher meaning or purpose. And I would include this in fantasy, pure illusion. All sorts of random things happen every day, everywhere, many of which have almost zero meaning or purpose, redeeming or otherwise. After the random thing happens, we sort of want to find a meaning. So we then start, say, we start playing mind games where we come up with rationalizations why it was good that something happened, and how it will be in our, quote, long-term benefit, how it'll allow us to see things differently, and all these rationalizations. But that's only what we do after the fact. After the event, it doesn't mean there was any meaning in what happened as it was happening. It could have been a totally random event that we then use in a positive sense, and we make some sort of positive gain from it, but that doesn't mean there was any meaning in what happened. It could have been a senseless act that we've used in a good way, but that doesn't take away the fact that there could be no meaning in a lot of things that happen. And the view that there is meaning in everything that happens is, I think, fantasy. So I fleshed out some things here. I think it's important. I think it's very important to distinguish between the thoughts that are reality-based and thoughts that are fantasy-based. Because the better you get at distinguishing, it's not so much that it's too simplistic to say, reality is good. It's good to always have a realistic viewpoint. And it's bad to have fantasy is bad, and so you should never indulge in fantasy. So you should always be in reality, and you should never be in fantasy. Well, not so much. I don't think that's true. The point is that you should be able to distinguish between the two well, and then play off one against the other. And so you know when you're in reality mode, and you know when you're in fantasy. And so when you're on vacation and you're just relaxing with people and you're talking about what you want to do in the future, and you can know that what you're saying or what you're thinking about, what you want to achieve, and you can be in fantasy mode then. But when you get right down to it, and when you start making decisions about your future and making key decisions about how your life's going to proceed, then you better be in reality mode. Because those are decisions that are going to reverberate. So it's not so simple to say reality is good, fantasy is bad. They both have some benefit. But the key point is to get the benefit is you need to know when you're in each one. And critically for long-term decisions and long-term decision making, some decision that would involve you repetitively in a certain behavior or pursuit, that is the one that you better be careful that you're in reality. So I'll have further reflections on this. I think this was a decent start. So we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.